Welcome to CMO Confidential, the podcast that takes you inside the drama, decisions, and choices that go with being the head of marketing. Hosted by five-time CMO Mike Linton.
Welcome, marketers, advertisers, and those who love them, the Chief Marketing Officer Confidential. CMO Confidential is a program that takes you inside the drama, the decisions, and the politics that go with being the head of marketing at any company in what is one of the most scrutinized jobs in the executive suite. I'm Mike Linton, the former Chief Marketing Officer of Best Buy, eBay, Farmers Insurance, and Ancestry.com, here today with my guest, Dr. Joel Shapiro. Today's topic, the Euro-Grocer case. It's not just about the data. Now, Joel is a professor at the Kellogg School of Business at Northwestern, where he has taught decision science for nearly 11 years after a stint as an associate dean. Prior to that, he was a doctoral fellow at Rand Corporation, and to top it off, he also has a degree in law. Welcome, Joel. We could talk to you about almost anything.
Yeah, you could talk to me about pretty much anything. I don't know if I didn't have any good answers, though. And the data stuff, I'm pretty good.
Well, so that's good. Let's go into the data stuff. Before we dig into this case, let's talk about, ground our listeners in what you teach and why. Like, tell us about economics and decision sciences.
Yeah, sure. So I'm happy to. So my background is really as like a data guy in public policy. So I did my PhD in policy analysis because I was always really interested in social systems and social science and how we can use data to make people's lives better. And that's kind of what I do, except I made a bit of a transition about 12 years ago into business. And, you know, for me, business moves fast. Businesses are accountable. When I was doing work in policy, it was too easy to write a report and it sits on a shelf and, you know, policy and government kind of moves slowly. So I found that a little frustrating. So really what I do now is I teach students how to use data and data science and analytics to make better decisions in business. And we move fast and make quick decisions and test things, and hopefully they're innovating along the way.
Which is, you know, I was going to ask you about why you didn't go to politics or medicine or something. And you just answered that, which is, I want to be teaching people about decisions that make things better at speed. Is that fair?
Yeah. I mean, I think sometimes, you know, we get a little bit too enamored with, you know, the big home run ideas, which is fine. Like big home run ideas are good. The issue that I have is sometimes data helps us make little better decisions. And over time, those aggregate pretty quickly. The problem with home run ideas is sometimes they work and sometimes they don't, and they can take a long time. But I love the fact when data helps us make little decisions better on a daily, hourly, weekly basis, because those things, as I said, they can aggregate pretty quickly. And I like that pace. And, you know, when you actually measure things, you can see that improvement over time, which helps give credence to this whole thing.
I think this, well, one, it's a lot like a 401k. You put in a little bit of money every year and suddenly there it is. And I think this is very apropos to marketing. And so, you know, when you look at the entire business landscape and you look at this use of data and decision sciences, talk to us about marketing versus other functions, just in general, writ large, about using data to drive decisions.
So I think of marketing as one of two functions in a business that is pretty mature around the use of data. I think operations is another one. So, you know, when people are in operations, they tend to think, my experience, they tend to think like an engineer. They know how to build strong systems that sort of everything works really well together and you get some reliable output out of it. Marketing to me is really good at using data for social systems that are comprised of people who do measurable things and their measurable outcomes, and the use of data to sort of inform what really works. Pretty mature. You know, I was the chief analytics officer at a sales software company. And when I started there, I made this terrible assumption. I was like, well, I bet salespeople use data really well because marketers use it really well. And in my mind, I was sort of connecting them. That was like the worst assumption I could have made. Marketing, really mature. Sales, not so much. And other parts of the business sort of vary as well.
And it's part of that, before we get to the Euro-Grocer case, it's part of that because the way the data is structured and absorbed by the sales force and the marketer, because if I'm sitting there, I have all this CRM data, all my search data, my digital data, and the Salesforce sometimes doesn't have that data. Is that the reason, or is there another reason why you made the wrong assumption on sales?
I think it has more to do with the fact that people in sales pride themselves on knowing how to work with people, and they've simply been more resistant to input from, some sort of heartless algorithm, something like that. I think it's more that people are a little bit more defiant in sales and say, no machine's going to tell me how to sell. I know how to sell. I've been doing this for a long time. And for whatever reason, marketing measured early. They came up with really good ways of measuring success and attribution and running experiments. And I wish I had cracked the nut on why sales hasn't done it as much, but I think it's just sort of this, I know how to sell. Don't let the data tell me. Don't tell me how to do it different.
And don't talk to me about those heartless, nefarious algorithms either. Those are for the marketers. Keep them in the back room. All right. So let's sketch out the case for the listeners, the Euro-Grocer case. And Euro-Grocer is a pseudonym for a real company. Even if you're Sherlock Holmes, you probably can't take a guess. But Joel, let's start with the business problem and then the data science solution.
Yeah. So I'm happy to. So Euro-Grocer, as you said, it's a pseudonym for a real company. Not surprisingly, it's a European grocery store chain. And super interesting case. I teach with it a lot, and it sounds sort of mundane on its face, I think, but there's so many layers to it that teach us some really interesting things. So here's the summary of the case. Euro-Grocer does about $8 billion a year in sales, and they had about a $250 million problem. And that problem was that they were ordering the wrong amount of stuff for their shelves. Sometimes they would have too much and it would spoil, and sometimes they wouldn't have enough. And both of those are problematic, right? You don't have enough, you forego profit. You have too much, you bought things that you didn't need to buy.
And we also know that the grocery margin is, I recall when I was in retail, if you could make over a 2, you were killing it.
Yeah.
And that's 2%. That's a 2% net. So you're killing it. So 250 million on 8 billion, that is a lot of money. Tell me if I'm getting that wrong, but that's my recollection of grocery.
No, that's exactly right. And it's so funny you say that, because I get some people when I teach this case and I'm like, it's a $250 million problem. And they'll be like, yeah, but they're 8 billion. It's only like 3%. So why did they even care? I'm like, well, where I come from, $250 million is a pretty big number. So they care, right? So that's the problem. They're not ordering the right amount of stuff. Okay. And this is a great data problem, because if you could predict demand, you could arguably order the right amount of stuff. Yeah.
Right.
And so what they do is they hire a data science consultancy to come in, a consulting firm to come in and, hey, can we actually predict demand? So that's sort of the context here. They bring in this consultant to try and predict demand, and they have a really high quality data science consultancy. And the very first thing that they do is they run up a little pilot test. Not everything is predictable. Like, don't spend a lot of money and resources hiring somebody to do this until you test it out first, because it's not predictable. You don't want to be, all in with a big price tag. Turns out it's pretty predictable. Demand is pretty predictable. Not perfectly so. Nobody's ever going to make the claim that you can know exactly how much to have on which shelves and blah, blah, blah.
But it's also just, if I want to make sure everyone's getting this right, because I would say it's grocery. So the market isn't like wildly expanding and contracting for something. It's kind of, you got your population around your stores, you're delivering all this stuff. You probably have an awful lot of your own first party data right here. So
Totally.
Me is a great data feed for somebody.
Yeah, exactly. So what they do is they try and predict the demand of different product categories at each one of these stores. How much, stuff are people going to buy in bakery at this one store, and dairy over here, and meat and seafood and so forth. And that's sort of the level at which they do the prediction. Can we predict category demand? And they have like 25 categories per store. Can we predict category demand at each one of these stores? So they do a little pilot test, and it turns out, as I said, they couldn't do perfect prediction. There's no way they're going to solve this whole $150 million. But the pilot test shows that they can get 42% of the way there. That's
real money when you're
real money.
You're working. I mean, you're sitting over 1% profit gain.
Yeah, seriously.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a $106 million improvement that this pilot test suggests. If you roll out this prediction more broadly, you're looking at $106 million. Okay. Next thing that you want to do as a business leader, if somebody says to you, you can do something that has a $106 million benefit, then I'm pretty sure your next question is, how much is it going to cost me?
Yes. But then generally, how much is it going to cost me? And under the assumption that we're not going to have to build something super new, how fast could we do it?
Yeah. Yeah. So really good question too. Capabilities were pretty much right there. They felt good about building it fast. And the price tag that they put on it was about $16 million. And I just want to pause on that for a second. So $106 million benefit for a $16 million investment. And this is annual.
So the 106 million is an annuity and the 16 million is a one-time cost.
$16 million is going to be
an annuity too. All right. So you're sitting there at a 64. Yeah. You're sitting there at a pretty big gain.
Yeah. I mean, there's a couple $1 million of upfront costs, but if you look at it yearly, it's about $16 million. Now, do the math on that. You can do the math. It's a 6.5 times return.
Yeah. So it's out in like 2 months.
I mean, it's the biggest no-brainer ever. Now, keep in mind, this was a pilot test, and we're talking about extrapolating these results to the broader enterprise. But if I told you that you could get $6.50 back for every dollar that you spend, that's going to get your attention. You know that's going to get your attention, right?
Yeah.
And what's interesting about this story is that, we could stop right here. We could be like, data, it's amazing, and analytics, and we could all raise our hands in victory and be excited about it. But that's not the way the story goes. So the Euro-Grocer board looks at this and they consider this $16 million a year investment and they say, thanks, but no thanks. We're going to pass. What? You're going to pass on it? Why would you possibly pass on an investment like that? And the reasons why they passed on it are where this turns fascinating and where there are a lot of lessons to be learned. And I can share those with you unless you want to.
Oh no, we want to hear, because this is where the data science consulting company is tearing its hair out and saying, this is one, I can't believe you're not going to do this. Two, this was a case study. We're going to share from stages all over the world about how great we are at consulting.
Yep.
Well, you're not going to do it. So tell our list why it didn't get done.
Yeah. So there are really 3 big things here that I'll highlight for you. So one of them is a little bit of the misalignment with the results of the data model with the realities of the business. And what I mean by that is you can tell a grocery store that I can predict exactly how many avocados people are going to want to buy next week and the week after, and you should make sure to order different amounts. But if you're locked into some supplier contracts, or if you've got some logistics processes that don't allow you to have that flexibility, you can't take full advantage of that, predictive accuracy. I sometimes refer to this as being a model-driven organization. You want to have your organization set up so that you can use the results of a quantitative model. That's really important to being successful with data. And in this one way, Euro-Grocer couldn't really adapt to the accuracy and the flexibility and the sort of periodic changes in those predictions. So that was one big issue. You with me?
Yeah. I mean, that says I know the answer, but I just can't do it.
Yeah.
I need to get 100 avocados for store A and 700 for store B. But since I can't actually get that done, I'm going to get 400 and send 400 to each store.
Yeah.
But I'm going to get 800 and send 400 to each store. Yeah.
And there's a cost to that, right? It's nothing more than just additional cost. But now the board is sort of like, man, we can't really do that. So maybe this isn't quite as good as it looks. The second thing that they have a problem with is they turn to the data science team and they're like, okay, you're telling us that, we need this many avocados here and this many here. Why is that? Oof. So that's a challenge for people who work with data models. When we build out data models, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes there's a trade-off between accuracy of models and transparency of models. So what they did here, the data science consultancy here built what's called a neural network. You might have heard of it. It's a really complex, complicated, technically advanced way of building a predictive model. And it's really good in accuracy and it's really bad in transparency. And when somebody who's in a position of decision-making authority says to you, explain to me why we should do this, when your only response is because the model tells me to, oof, that's a challenge.
That is, because you'd be saying, look, why is this one store, sticking with the avocado strategy, why are they selling 7 times more avocados than this other store that's only 70 miles away?
Yeah. And you're
40 kilometers away, since we're doing a European grocer. So, yeah.
Yeah. So, when people ask you why and you can't answer why, sometimes that can be a problem. And this is always an issue with people in data. Are we building models to be maximally useful or transparent? And when those two things are in tension, one of them has to give, and it's not always clear which one of them it should be.
Okay, you said there was a third thing, I think. Did we get them all out?
No, we didn't. So the third is so fascinating, and it just speaks to such a broader sort of, area and concern that I have with data. When the store managers were brought in on this, they saw that little parts of the data didn't quite look right to them. It was like, oh, this shows that orange juice was on sale at this year. I've been a store manager here for 20 years, and we've never put orange juice on sale. I don't think your data's right. It turns out that there were some errors in the data. So the data science consultancy team goes back to it and they're like, oh, we'll fix the errors and so forth. And they fixed the errors and they reran the analysis and it all looked about the same. The errors were very minimal. But once people lose faith or trust in the data, it's really hard to get it back. And now all of a sudden you're in a position of, you told me the results the first time and the data was wrong. How do I know whether I can believe you now? And that notion of people not trusting the data, I find fascinating and important, and one of the sort of least understood or remedied things that we need to talk about in the data space. And those three things together, not being able to use the data well, the lack of transparency in the model, and lack of trust in the data, ended up killing it. And the board at Euro-Grocer said, $16 million is still a lot of money, and we're going to do other things instead now.
Oh, hey, I have to do a couple follow-ons on this one. The first is, having been in a lot of companies, sometimes the culture, it just wants to resist this. And if it's resisting, it will find any reason, like the data or the avocado difference, and it will just keep pecking away at this until it finds a reason to not accept it. And there's other companies that are more on the forefront of, oh my God, we know we got to do something, that will say, they'll see the over $100 million savings and they'll go, all right, there might be some errors in this, but we got to go get it. So let's overcome the errors. How much of this is culture and how much of this is the pure presentation of the model? I know you can't actually split this out, but the pure presentation of the model by the data people.
Yeah, it's a really good question. As you know, I don't really know the answer to this. I mean, I will say that any organization that's serious enough to bring in a top flight data science consulting firm to do this, I think at some point the culture's got to be there. I mean, it's possible that someone, okays it and then they're not involved in the decision-making, so it all apart. But I think those are the two issues, and I don't know which one is which in this case.
Okay, we're going to talk about what people should do when they're in this kind of position and how to make sure it gets through the company. But when you look at AI now and the answers AI is producing, and then you want the transparency of AI, which to me looks like it's really challenging to figure out any transparency. How does this speak to companies taking all the AI information they get and then absorbing it? Because it sounds like this grocer would say, well, I can't possibly see anything in this giant LLM model. I'm not going to do anything. What do you think is going to happen on that front?
Well, I mean, I think one of the nice things about LLMs is that if you review what an LLM tells you, a large language model tells you that you should do something, I think we're still at the point where a lot of people don't sort of just blindly follow it. Like
Okay.
it says something to you that, this might be a good idea or you should go execute this strategy. And I think people, still tend to be responsible and accountable. And I think that there's this accountability that keeps people from doing too many crazy things with LLMs. So I think we're in an okay shape with that. When it comes to actually taking like quantity, like when we talk about AI, like predictive modeling, there's a lot of really poor understanding of how these kinds of quantitative outputs can be used. And so, as things get automated, LLMs get more and more dangerous because they stop having a layer of human
Right.
sort of review on them. So that concerns me. But, the marketing person who uses an LLM to sort of help them come up with a strategy, the one who's like actually reading the output and being like, it's a good idea. And do I have evidence that supports that? That feels like a still very human thing to me. So I'm heartened by that.
So as long as AI has some adult supervision, you would feel comfortable. Let's go back to the avocado analogy.
Yeah.
You're a grocer. What are you teaching your students about, other than these three points you made? What are some best practices our listeners can take away when they're trying to push data through the company? Because I think you mentioned the difference between data leadership and data science. Give our listeners some tips.
So I actually talk a lot about data leadership. I just taught a new course on data leadership at Kellogg this last year, which was really interesting. Sort of I have like these 7 big things that we talk about, but sort of most relevant to what you're talking about here is building trust is just incredibly important. And, one of the most important things about building trust is expectations up front. And so if we just talk about like something in the Euro-Grocer case with the errors in the data, one of the most important things that I do with anybody at the beginning of a data project is tell them that there will be errors. Data is always imperfect. It is always imperfect. And, I don't think people lose trust when mistakes are made. I think people lose trust when no one talks about the mistakes. And more than anything else, I tell people that if you're going to be successful with data, you got to set the right expectations and you got to be transparent with things when they are imperfect. And that's just how to be influential, I think, generally, and how to get people to trust you generally. Super important with data.
Got it. Any other tips you would throw down before we move on to the next topic?
No, I mean, you always want to know your audience and you want to make sure that you know what they care about, right? I work with a lot of data teams on improving their communication and because they're not always the best communicators, as you could probably imagine, people who are really good with data. And the 2 things I always tell them are, know exactly what the purpose of your communication is. Are you trying to sell somebody something? Are you trying to make yourself look like the smartest person in the room? Are you trying to influence a decision? So know what you're trying to do and know what your audience cares about. And if you're really purposeful about that, a lot of communication issues can be solved for.
I like it. We did a show with DJ Patel, a big data scientist, and he said, you need a Spock on the bridge, but Spock needs to be able to talk to the crew, and the crew needs to be able to talk to Spock before anything happens.
Yeah.
And so I think that's really good. I know you have another case, or maybe 2, that deal with asymmetrical risk. So let's talk about asymmetrical risk for our listeners, and then give us the thumbnail, and then we'll talk about case 1 and maybe case 2.
Yeah, sure. So I told you before that my background is in public policy analysis, and it's
Right.
Sort of earned my stripes, so to speak, as an academic around more public policy issues before I shifted to more business stuff. And so anytime I see something that's more sort of in the policy space, my radar always goes up and I'm interested. And so there's a super interesting and totally sort of different context here than the Euro-Grocer case a number of years ago. So the state of Illinois, their Department of Child and Family Services had started being more data-driven. And what they had done was they had started using a predictive model that was intended to help them predict kids at risk of bad outcomes, specifically around like being abused or even perhaps being abused so badly that they might even die, right? It was a risk tool, a risk detection tool that was supposed to help their caseworkers find kids who are more at risk than they might otherwise realize, so they could deploy resources to the kids most in need of these resources. That's sort of the overall thing. It worked really well in other jurisdictions, but in Illinois, it completely tanks. And the reason it tanks is for two things in particular. Number one, the model starts predicting that lots and lots and lots of kids, thousands of kids, are in like imminent danger.
Yeah.
Didn't seem realistic to anybody. But at the same time, there were these two toddlers. If you live in the Chicago area, like during the 2010s, early 2010s, late 2010s, something like that, two toddlers, tragic incidents of kids who are actually killed by their abusers. Just the worst possible case you can imagine. And when you go back to the predictive model, that model actually predicted that both of those kids were safe. It didn't have them as high risk according to their prediction. And so the head of this department, the DCFS at the Department of Child and Family Services in the state of Illinois, looks at this thing and she goes, it's predicting too much risk for some kids. It's predicting that these two kids weren't at risk and they ended up in these tragic, circumstances. We're getting rid of the tool. It's not really helping us. And it's such a misread and a missed opportunity of how data can be helpful to us. And I'm happy to sort of wear that the asymmetry.
Right. And the asymmetry there is, look, there's a false positive and a false negative, but the consequences of one brings terrible outcomes to the kids, but also, the PR and the entire questioning of the model blows this up. So that's the asymmetry. How give us lessons learned from this thing, and what should you be doing if you're dealing with a super asymmetrical risk?
Yeah. So look, when we start talking about data and doing predictions and stuff, sometimes you're right, sometimes you're wrong. We call those things, when you're wrong, false positives or false negatives. When you're right, they're true positives and true negatives. And a lot of times we get a little overly reliant on the technical folks to sort of build models that sort of optimize on these measurements.
Yeah.
Business people need to know what the costs of being wrong and the benefits of being right are, because there is asymmetry. In that child welfare case, a false positive means that you think a child's at risk when they're not. Maybe it's not so bad. You throw some resources at a kid who need it. Maybe it does get bad. Maybe you pull somebody out of a home when it wasn't merited. It can get bad. But man, the false negative is the worst. A child did protection and we didn't get to them.
Yeah.
Those costs, whether financial or human life or whatever else, those costs need to be known and managed by business leaders if they want to be successful, because they're the ones who need to sort of understand how the data influences the deployment of resources. And that's true if you're trying to save kids. It's true if you're trying to save customers. If you're trying to save customers, there's a much easier dollar figure to put on it. But that's the lesson, is that decision makers, the business leaders, need to understand deeply the cost of being wrong, the benefits of being right, because otherwise that model is going to lead you to do things that might not make a whole lot of sense.
Yeah, and that is, I hear you saying, look, analytically understand the asymmetry. Like if you should be weighting this super heavily towards one side. Because of the asymmetry. I know you just in our pre-talk, you were working on some other like asymmetrical risk, I think, or other thing along these lines in sports.
Yeah.
No, you're not done with this, but if you want to give us a preview, I'm sure our listeners will want to hear about it. So knock yourself out.
Yeah. So I do a lot of work with professional sports teams, both on the business side, like the classic business stuff, marketing and sponsorship and, digital engagement for fans and so forth. Sort of the fun stuff is the performance side and helping teams sort of build strong, competitive, rosters. And so part of what I've been doing is trying to understand how teams can plan for adversity. And adversity can be things like a player gets injured, an expensive player gets injured, or even like underperformance. And those kinds of things are predictable. And that's where the data and the AI come in. So if we can predict adversity, can we build our teams to be resilient in the face of that adversity? And this is something that I like to refer to as resilience by design. It's not just unexpected stuff comes up and we fight our way through it. That's a great kind of resilience, but can we plan for it? And the answer is probably yes. Like you said, I'm sort of right in the middle of this research here. But, if you can imagine that there is a team in the NFL where I've been, focusing most of my data, if you get most of my research and my analysis, if you have a player, a superstar, and they're getting a little bit older and your data tells you that they're going to drop off or they might get injured, sometimes teams will say, okay, that's it. We're going to trade them. We're not going to re-sign them, whatever it is. And what happens then? If that player continues to be great, that's maybe a false positive.
Right.
How you say it could be a false negative, I suppose. But what happens if you gave up on this great player? The fans get upset. You missed on the opportunity to keep them and so forth. And the ways in which we talk about asymmetrical risk, false positives and false negatives, when it comes to bringing talent onto your team and becoming competitive and remaining competitive, it's really interesting when we start thinking about it in sports. One of the fun things about sports is everything is so easily measurable.
Oh, yeah.
Productivity of a team is, did you win the game? Did you make the playoffs? And so this notion of can we predict adversity and be resilient to adversity really becomes interesting, and it's fun because I'm a sports fan.
All right. So if we on the show, if you are willing to share this with our listeners when it's done.
Yeah, totally. That would
be super fun. So, all right. So we're running towards the end of the show. Before we get to our last question, our famous last question, or we like to think it's famous anyways, what should our listeners take away from all this? Just from your chair, you're talking to all these business folks out there. What would you tell them?
I think, one of the most important takeaways from all of this is what everybody knows, but it's going to be a reminder, which is that, data doesn't make decisions. Data doesn't make decisions. People make decisions. And, data needs to be helpful to them. And that means it needs to be meaningful. It needs to be actionable, but it also needs to be presented to them in ways that, get them to buy in and trust. And, there's so much more to success with data today than just the technical components to it. And I know people know that, but I think sometimes it gets a little bit underappreciated by both the data teams and the business teams.
I think that's a super wrap on the show, which brings us to our traditional last question. You could take both parts of this or one, but you have to take at least one.
Okay.
So practical advice for our audience we haven't discussed yet, and or the funniest story you can share on the air.
I find it very hard to be funny on demand. So I'm gonna share just a quick snippet here. When I was doing a big consulting gig with a big financial services firm, helping them sort of become more data driven and all this kind of stuff, this big training program, getting ready to go out in front of this crowd. All their employees were super excited and jazzed up about this new analytics program. And one of the corporate sponsors, one of the bigwigs at the company, pulls me aside before I go out. And he says to me, I'm glad you're here. I'm glad we're doing this program. The data team is pissing me off. That was a weird thing to tell me. I'd never met this guy before. I think highly of their data team. I'm like, what's going on? He said, you know what? I know my business really well. I know what I'm doing. And they keep trying to tell us what to do. God, and that just stuck. That just resonated with me that if we in the data space continue to be seen as telling smart and accomplished people what to do differently, we're all kind of sunk. It's just not the way to make change in an organization. And just the way he said it with sort of such, ferocity. They keep trying to tell me what to do. And so that just was a big moment in my career about thinking about making sure data solves problems, but making sure that we know how to work with people to make sure that we are supporting them and not trying to tell them what to do differently, because there's just almost no way that that's going to work. So the practical advice is for the business teams, maybe be a little bit more tolerant of the data teams who think they've got the one right answer, but for the data teams to be really good at thinking more deliberately about how to influence business people to do what the data might suggest is a great idea.
I think that is a great wrap. And the lesson that I have always taken away is the difference is whoever is making the decision owns the consequence, and the data team usually doesn't own the consequence, which means the data team has to be aware of how that leader is leading, and the leader has to trust the data team enough to take some risk with them. So
Yeah, I love that. Great way of putting it.
I think that is a great way to wrap the show. Thank you so much, Joel. We'll see you later. And thanks to everyone for listening to CMO Confidential. If you're enjoying the show, hit the like button and subscribe, and look for all of our shows on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, and the I Hear Everything network, which include The Rise and Fall of Peloton as seen through the lens of CLTV, The Budweiser Case, How Not to Manage Sociopolitical Issues, The Warby Parker Case, I Can See Clearly Now with My CLTV Glasses On, and Is Artificial Intelligence Like Taking the Red Pill or the Blue Pill? Hey, all you marketers, stay safe out there. This is Mike Linton signing off for CMO Confidential.